Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the lymphatic system, and this is an introduction to the lymphatic system lab, in which we're going to look at some evidence-based interventions like lymphatic massage that people can do to improve the function of their lymphatic system, while also understanding this often, I think, misunderstood system. So overall, what the lymphatic system does for you is that it functions to protect your body as a component of the immune system. So you can see all throughout this guy's body here, you see this system of vessels and these nodes. These are the lymph vessels and lymph nodes. So the fluids that are bathing your tissues get passed into the lymph vessels and then ultimately to the lymph nodes, where that fluid is going to be exposed to B and T cells and other immune cells that are monitoring that fluid to check for pathogens, foreign materials, cell debris, and etc. So the lymph nodes are kind of like checkpoints that are filled with immune cells that will mount an immune response if you're being infected or invaded by a virus or bacteria or other foreign material. Another role that the lymphatic vessels play is to absorb dietary fat. So it turns out that most fats are going to be too large to pass through your capillaries, unlike most nutrients, which are absorbed by the capillaries in your small intestines. These are instead going to be absorbed by little components of the lymphatic system that are called lacteals, and that's how your how the fats get absorbed and how they get transported ultimately as all lymph fluid does, back to your blood circulation. Okay, and then another super critical thing that the lymphatic system does for you is to maintain your fluid levels. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a minute, but basically, in order to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the cells of your tissues, you're pumping blood, and that blood is going to smaller and smaller arteries till it eventually arrives at the capillary beds of that tissue. And then some of the fluid that's in those capillary beds and those arterioles gets extruded, is pushed out of the capillary beds, and then it's surrounding the cells of your tissues. That's how the tissues get nutrients and oxygen. Some of that fluid that gets pushed out is reabsorbed by your the venous end of your capillaries, but some of it is not, because it's not a closed tube. Some of that fluid gets left behind in the tissues. So if you did not have a lymphatic system to pick up that excess fluid, you would end up having massive edema or swelling. Ultimately, like I said a moment ago, that fluid that bathes your tissues, that we call lymphatic fluid, once it's picked up by the lymphatic vessels, goes back to circulation with the rest of your blood. And we'll talk about exactly how that happens as we go along. All right, so the main components of your lymphatic system are your lymphatic vessels, also known commonly as just lymphatics. And the lymphatic vessels only go in one direction. They're carrying fluid all the time from your peripheral tissues to your venous return to the vena cava. The fluid that's in the lymphatic vessels is called lymph. It's very similar to plasma in your blood, and so it is just a liquid component of your blood with a few proteins and other dissolved things that get pushed out of your blood vessels in your capillaries. Okay, but once that fluid gets picked up by a lymphatic vessel, it's then called lymph. The lymphocytes are immune cells that mount immune responses, like I mentioned a moment ago, and you've got lots of them in your lymph nodes where they're monitoring all the fluid that passes by them. Then finally, we have some specific lymphoid tissues and lymphoid organs. We'll look at, for example, the spleen and your various lymph nodes, and some other examples like your tonsils and malts, etc. Okay. So this picture is going to help us, I hope, to understand what's happening here. And I find this to be super fascinating, and this is an area of growing research. So it was just discovered that the brain has its own lymphatic system in 2012, and we're just beginning to understand what the implications of that are for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other neurodegenerative diseases, and then what you can actually do about it. Anyway, so like I mentioned before, your heart is pumping blood, right? And the reason that it's doing that is so that it can deliver oxygen and nutrients to your tissues and then remove the waste. So that blood is passing through smaller and smaller arteries till it arrives in these arterioles at the beginning of a capillary bed. As the blood goes through the capillary bed here, these capillaries are sort of leaky tubes. They're fenestrated, so some of the fluid that's in these capillaries is going to end up coming out of the capillaries and into this space where your cells are, where your tissue cells are, that's known as the interstitial space. So those arteries, like I said, are under pressure because of the pumping of your heart. And so that fluid and small proteins are going to leak or be extruded out of those capillaries. And again, that's super important because that's how your tissues get nutrients and oxygen. You know, it's no good to have your nutrients and oxygen just stuck inside of the tubes of your blood vessels. You need to get them out to the tissues and cells that need them. So every day, about 20 liters of fluid total seeps out into that interstitial space, the space again that's around your tissues. Most of it, so 17 out of that 20, is going to be reabsorbed directly by the venous capillaries. But every day, something like 3 liters is going to be left behind by your it's not going to be picked up by the venous capillaries, and instead it will be picked up by your lymphatic system. And ultimately, that is going to be returned, like I mentioned a minute ago, back to your blood circulation. So that fluid, like I said, is around the tissue and around these cells here. But then how is it going to get into these lymphatic capillaries? Well, the lymphatic capillaries are composed of just single layer of endothelial cells. You can see I just outlined one there. And those endothelial cells are kind of overlapping in a series of flaps. And those flaps are capable of opening one way to allow fluid to enter into those lymphatic vessels. So unlike your circulatory system, your lymphatic vessels do not have a pump, right? The heart is pumping blood through your circulatory system, but there is no pump that's going to be centrally moving all of the fluid through your lymphatic system. Instead, what's happening in your lymphatic system is that every time your skeletal muscles contract, so if you're like looking at the lymphatic vessels that are passing through my forearm, each time I'm contracting my forearm and using those muscles, that's putting a little bit of pressure on those lymphatic capillaries, and it's squeezing some of the fluid around them. And because these capillaries have these one-way flaps, when that squishing happens, the fluid can only enter into these capillaries. Okay, you also have flaps on the inside of these capillaries. You can see one here, which prevent that fluid from flowing out backwards in the capillary. So again, the endothelial flaps shown here allow fluid to enter, and then these backflow prevention valves make sure that that fluid is always moving in one direction, which is always back towards your heart, ultimately back towards the vena cava. Once that fluid is in your lymphatic capillaries, it travels through a series of larger and larger tubes. So from lymphatic capillaries to collecting vessels, to the lymphatic trunks, and then ultimately all of that fluid ends up either in the right lymphatic duct or into the thoracic duct, and then either goes into the subclavian vein on the right, on the left, or the subclavian vein on the right, which then is going to dump into the superior vena cava, as I was saying before. And so, somewhat interestingly, you can see that most of your body is drained by the thoracic duct, which is on the left side. And the right lymphatic duct, pictured here, only drains this upper right quadrant of your body. So that means if you're doing a lymphatic massage, for example, it's going to be more productive to concentrate on the left side because that's where most of the fluid is going to be returned into your circulation. All right, that's just to show you a little bit closer up the thoracic duct here. That's again dumping into that subclavian vein just above the vena cava, and then the right lymphatic duct, which is dumping into the right subclavian vein, also right above the superior vena cava. Let's just skip over some of this anatomical detail. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, in addition to these vessels, you have a number of structures, primary structures and secondary lymphatic structures, which help to perform those functions of the lymphatic system that we talked about at the beginning: absorbing fats, fighting off infectious things, and reabsorbing fluids. So the things that are called primary lymphatic structures include your thymus and your red bone marrow. So you remember red bone marrow we saw before back in 141 is where all of your blood cells are made, red blood cells and white blood cells alike. So the things that are primary lymphatic structures are involved in the formation and maturation of lymphocytes, these white blood cells. The thymus is an area that your T cells specifically go to mature and to be tested for self recognition. So you don't want T cells, or any immune cell for that matter, that's going to attack the cells of your own body. So the thymus is kind of like a training camp where your T cells get trained and eliminated if they target your own body. It's also interesting because the thymus is big when you're a baby and it gets smaller and smaller as you get older. Okay, so then you have a number of secondary lymphatic structures which are not involved directly in the formation or maturation of lymphocytes, but instead are going to house a bunch of immune cells. So the ones probably most obvious are the lymph nodes. As I've been saying, those lymph nodes are these little balls all along the way of your lymphatic vessels that are full of immune cells that are sampling the fluid that's passing by and then mounting an immune response. So for example, let's say you've got an infection here in your wrist, and that some bacteria is invading the musculature of your wrist. Some of that fluid, some of the fluid from your blood will be squished out at the capillaries, becoming interstitial fluid. It will wash over that bacteria and either carry the bacteria or itself or an immune cell that has eaten some of the bacteria. And it will carry that down the lymphatic vessels till it runs into a lymph node. So for example, it's kind of blurry here, but there's some lymph nodes here. And then those lymph nodes contain the B and T cells and other immune cells that will sample that fluid to see if there's an infectious agent there. So we just said there is an infection, so if they sense that, then they'll mount an immune response and they start proliferating, growing more clones and other immune cells, and so that lymph node might then swell because of that. Okay, so again, those secondary lymphatic structures include lymph nodes. They also include your tonsils, your spleen, which is unusual because it processes blood rather than lymph, and it also includes this thing we often treat as kind of a factoid here. The MALTs are mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue in your small intestines, but actually this is where the majority of your lymphatic tissue is in your digestive system, because of course your digestive system is the system that is the most exposed to the elements of the outside world. Every single thing that you eat is going to have some level of bacteria and viruses and foreign particles on it. So your digestive system has this challenge that it needs to be able to allow things in and to absorb nutrients and the things that you need while also keeping out the things that could harm you. And so for that reason, you have a lot of lymphatic tissue housing a lot of immune cells in your digestive system, and those are collectively known as MALTs, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. All right, just to review, I mentioned already the red bone marrow is where you make all of your different blood cells. This is why it's primary lymphatic tissue, your red blood cells, as well as all your different white blood cells for your immune response. The thymus, like I said before, is that area where your T cells go to grow and mature. to make sure that they don't target the cells of your own body. And this is bigger when you're a child versus when you're an adult. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these secondary lymphatic structures, because these are the ones we're going to have some ability to influence through lymphatic massage and other interventions like deep breathing and regular exercise. So the lymph nodes, like I mentioned before, fluid is coming in through your lymphatic vessels, and it can only go in one direction, right, because we have all these one-way valves. When it enters into the lymph nodes have a bunch of immune cells, particularly antigen-presenting cells, B cells, and T cells that sample that fluid. And if they sense something that shouldn't be there, these lymphocytes, those immune cells, may initiate an immune response. The spleen is similar, but instead of filtering lymph, it actually filters blood. It's still considered to be a lymphoid organ because it's involved in lymphocyte activation, the activation of those immune cells. It's a very similar thing that's happening here. So you have blood flowing into the spleen, and it's being sampled by a lot of immune cells that are going to be able to remove foreign particles, clear out broken down red blood cells. Remember, your red blood cells don't have any nuclei, so they have very limited self-repair capabilities, so you kind of use them and then destroy them and then make new ones. It also is a storage site for red blood cells and platelets in case you're bleeding a lot and you need to have that additional blood. Tonsils, similar to a lymphatic node. Again, you have a bunch of B and T cells here that are monitoring the stuff that you're putting into your mouth when you're eating or when you're inhaling, either through your nose or through your mouth. Okay, then the malts, like I mentioned before, are these collections of lymphatic tissue in your digestive system. And again, most people don't spend much time thinking about this, but we now know that the digestive system has the very highest concentration of lymphoid tissue. And again, that's hopefully straightforward. That's because it has the most exposure to foreign molecules, because you're putting stuff in there all the time through your food. And so as we think about disorders of lymphatic systems or immune responses in general, of which we have lots, right? Because most chronic diseases, or perhaps all chronic diseases, the thing that they have in common is chronic inflammation. And it's thought now that much of that chronic inflammation may be mediated or at least contributed to by something going wrong in your digestive system, which ultimately is going to have something to do with these malts, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues in your digestive system. Okay, and then I've been somewhat amazed to find out that your brain also has a lymphatic system. I'm not amazed that your brain has a lymphatic system, but what I am amazed by is that we didn't know your brain had a lymphatic system until 2012. So like I said, this is a relatively new discovery, and the implications of this are still being worked out. The most important thing, I think, the take home about the lymphatic system is that it is most active during sleep. So like lymph fluid, right, the lymphatic fluid is washing over the tissues in your brain, and it's removing wastes and foreign particles, bacteria and viruses that may have found their way in there, and anything else that shouldn't be there. So this is how your brain cleans out its junk. And this is happening primarily when you are sleeping in deep sleep. So if you are not getting adequate deep sleep, then you're accumulating these waste products in your brain, and this is thought now to be related to Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and other neurodegenerative diseases. I don't want to go through all of the details here, but just to kind of give you an idea of how this functions, I think this is interesting, so I will go a little bit into the cerebrospinal fluid, which is what is bathing all of your brain and spinal cord. And if you've ever watched like a brain surgery, or ever see somebody cut through the dirt of the brain, you'll see there's this clear liquid that's in there, and that's cerebrospinal fluid. Or even in a spinal tap, you can see that clear fluid. So that fluid is being made in the choroid plexus, and if you remember, or if you did that brain dissection, the choroid plexus is this reddish stuff you can see inside of the ventricles of the brain. So the same thing is happening in the choroid plexus as what we talked about in your capillary beds, that you basically have some leaky tubes, right? The arterioles are coming into a capillary bed, that's choroid plexus, and some of the liquid is being pushed out of those capillary beds into the space on the outside. So in the brain, that fluid, once it gets pushed out of the choroid plexus, is called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. The brain has a lot more specific control over exactly what's allowed to be in that fluid, and it's thought that astrocytes, which is a type of cell in your brain, play a big role in determining what is allowed into that fluid and what isn't. So that cerebrospinal fluid flows through your ventricles, from the lateral ventricles, third, and then the fourth, until eventually it enters that subarachnoid space. And if you remember that arachnoid is one of the meninges, one of the kind of saran wrap layers covering your brain. So then in the subarachnoid space, that CSF is surrounding the brain and spinal cord and bathing it. Okay, and then this is where it gets weird. So then that cerebrospinal fluid follows the arteries that are going deep into your brain, and it travels in the spaces around the arteries. So in this picture, they're trying to show that here's a subarachnoid space, right? So if you cut through the skull, then you'll see the meninges right below that, and then below the meninges you have that subarachnoid space. So we already saw how the fluid gets into the subarachnoid space, and then you have these different arteries, right, that are going deep into the brain, again, to carry oxygen and nutrients and stuff. And the cerebrospinal fluid is traveling on the outside of the arteries in what's called the periarterial space, the space around the arteries. So as it travels in that periarterial space, the astrocytes, and you can see an astrocyte here, there's a bunch of them in this picture with all these little octopus-like legs. The astrocytes are going to determine when and what is allowed out of that periarterial space, so what fluid will be allowed to enter into the space surrounding the cells, the neurons, and other cells in your brain. And that's important because that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to pick up metabolic waste and other things which should not be in your brain. And again, that's happening primarily like 60 or 70% during deep sleep. So finally, that waste is going to flow through the different cells and tissues of your brains until it enters into the space around the veins. So then it's going to travel through that perivenous space, and ultimately that is going to go into the lymphatic vessels that are in your dura, and then finally to your cervical lymph nodes, where it will then connect to the right or left subclavian vein to return the fluid to circulation. So the lymphatic system is not exactly the same as your lymphatic system, but they have a lot of similarities and they perform the same function. They both have leaky capillary systems. In the lymphatic system, the leaky capillary system is called the choroid plexus. That's the origination of the fluid. One of the main differences is that you don't have a separate series of vessels in the lymphatic system. It's just traveling, again, in that periarterial space. Peri means around, so it's around the arteries, and then into the venous space on the way back out. All right, so why are we talking about any of this? Why should you care? Well, there's a number of things that go wrong with the lymphatic system, and I've kind of arranged these by our level of evidence, not necessarily by level of importance, because like I said, a lot of this is emerging understanding and emerging research. So lymphedema is swelling, and it can be because you have had surgery that removed lymph nodes. So for example, in breast cancer, they often remove some of the axillary lymph nodes, around the armpit area or lateral to the breast tissue. And that can result in swelling because then you've blocked the flow of the lymphatic tissue out of your periphery, out of the arms, for example. So surgery, radiation, and different infections like cellulitis can cause lymphedema. I just mentioned cellulitis, so that's a type of recurring infection. And then some types of cancer. So lymphoma is a cancer of the lymphatic system, and other cancers that are not necessarily of the lymphatic system can spread through the lymphatic system. So in order to prevent the spread, sometimes you may remove lymph nodes, and that can result in this swelling, lymphedema. There's emerging evidence that impaired lymphatic function or flow is also implicated in chronic inflammation and autoimmune diseases, which, like I mentioned at the beginning, is kind of the what is common for all chronic diseases is that chronic inflammation. It's also thought to be have an effect in obesity and metabolic syndrome. It's kind of a chicken-egg thing here. Obesity can impair lymphatic flow, and then impaired lymphatic flow can have a negative effect on obesity metrics. Can result in impaired wound healing. I think that makes sense if you're not going to be able to monitor very well the fluids that are circulating through your body and mount immune responses where necessary. This is going to result in impaired wound healing. And then there's this rare intestinal condition that I basically don't know anything about. Okay, and then I think even more interesting, and these are areas of emerging research. Oh, what happened to this dude's arm? Anyway, in this third tier, we have brain fog. So, if you didn't sleep well, or perhaps even if you have a hangover, perhaps that is because of impaired clearance of your lymphatic system in your brain. And we know most people, many people, perhaps the majority of people, are not getting adequate sleep in developed nations. I don't know what this means. Chronic heaviness should be chronic fatigue, so persistent tiredness, or chronic fatigue could also be because of that impaired lymphatic flow. Persistent aches, stiffness, and joint pain, digestive issues. For example, I mentioned that the malts in the digestive system are the most common lymphatic tissue. And then skin irritation and rashes may also be impaired or may be caused or contributed to by impaired lymphatic flow. So, this is an important thing, an emerging area of research, and I think we're going to see more and more research into the link between lymphatic flow and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and that's an opportunity to then be able to do something about it. So these are some of the things you can do about it, and that's kind of what you're going to look at mostly in the lab. So I have arranged these again according to their to the evidence. So you have clinically proven interventions, and then some foundational habits, and both groups here have things with high evidence and with lower evidence. So let me look at the foundational habits first, because this is really the most important stuff. Physical activity is the number one best intervention for lymphatic function, and really for lots of things. But it's because, again, that you don't have a pump in your lymph vessels, that the fluid is moved because of our skeletal muscles contracting. It's also moved by the contraction and movement of the diaphragm. So diaphragmatic breathing is also important. And we know that in industrialized countries, in the US in particular, levels of physical activity are very low, way lower than the recommendation. There's also some thought, and I don't know if this is proven or not, that we are in a more sympathetic state in these industrialized nations, and as a result, we're doing a lot more shallow, rapid breathing and less diaphragmatic breathing. In any case, by increasing your diaphragmatic breathing and physical exercise, you can improve the function of your lymphatic system. Quality sleep is super important. There's a lot of evidence for this now for the lymphatic system. Like I said before, during deep sleep, your brain is clearing out something like 60% of the flow that occurs in the lymphatic system. So getting to those deep sleep stages is super important for your long-term brain health. Hydration is also important because, at its base, all of that fluid, as well as the fluid in your blood, is coming from water, right, that you drink or get through food. All right, then as far as clinical interventions, manual lymphatic drainage has a lot of support for it, for this clinical lymphedema, for this clinical swelling. Looks like very often is done post breast cancer surgery, again because you remove some of the lymph nodes there to reduce the swelling of the upper limbs. And it's a specific type of massage that we're going to look at in the lab today that's very unintuitive, at least to me, because it's like super gentle and you have to do it very gently in a specific order and specific direction. Compression therapy is a similar thing. You're squeezing the tissue to prevent the fluid from filling up in that tissue. And if you understand how the lymphatic vessels function, you understand how this is forcing fluid back into the lymphatic capillaries. Decongestive exercises are gentle exercises like pumping your fist, for example. That's to use the skeletal muscles as a pump. Then skin care and surgical interventions are perhaps less super well, the skincare is less well supported for lymphedema in general, though in cellulitis it can be important. And then there are some surgical interventions as well where you connect lymphatic vessels directly to veins if you have some kind of blockage or you've had to remove a lymph node because of cancer or other surgery. Anyway, so I hope that helps. Like I said, I find it very interesting because we don't really think about the lymphatic system a lot, but I think it's time we start thinking about it. And if you think about how oxygen and nutrients are getting to the tissues, I think you'll see that it's necessary that that tissue leaves the blood capillaries in order to deliver that to the cells of your tissues. And that is why then you need a lymphatic system to pick that stuff up. And that's a critical part of your immune system function. And it's something that probably in our modern society, we don't have great function of our lymphatic systems. And we're exposed to many more foreign particles in the air and in the food that we eat. We don't have great lymphatic functioning as a whole because of our lack of physical exercise, number one, but also perhaps because of a reduction in deep diaphragmatic breathing.